right, so continuing on from the last lecture, we started talking, or we were going to talk about, whoops, let me move this so you can see that. We were going to talk about energy, the basal metabolic rate, that is the energy needed for basically no activity. And this figure right here is comparing the energy or the basal metabolic rate, or BMR, of various types of organisms, all right? So this is talking about a pregnant woman versus, let's say, a bird living in a very cold environment. This is supposed to be a penguin, versus a mouse that is like in North America, versus these guys are all over here are ectotherms, so let's say a snake of some sort, all right? So let's just quickly look at this. I'll see if I can blow it up so you can look at it a little closer. All right, so just so you can kind of see what these things are before I scan back out so you can do more of a comparison, you can see the basal metabolic rate is in blue. So if I'm looking just across the board, blue is my basal. And the basal metabolic rate is fairly high for somebody that is pregnant, all right? That is the reproductive. In fact, all of these are reproductive. My activity costs so these are what they call energy budgets. I have some going into activity. I have some going into growth, and of course this is growth of the baby at the time, temperature regulation costs, and reproduction costs. So these are kind of, well, actually I guess growth here is the growth of her, which you know, she doesn't have much happening, but has reproductive costs, all right? So these are just sort of a comparison of the different kinds of things. So let's scan back out and look at them in comparison. So just looking across the board, hopefully you can see that pretty well. You can see that the blue is basal metabolic rate. So for something that is smaller, it has a lower basal metabolic rate. Smaller still lower. And though an ectotherm, a lot of its energy budget is actually, even though it's relatively small, just for an ectotherm, it's got its basal metabolic rate is a lot of its energy budget. The other thing is activity costs. Activity costs, that is large, is activity costs. Activity costs are here in yellow. So for a mammal or human, large animal, the activity cost relatively is somewhat smaller than the basal metabolic rate, whereas for a smaller animal, but also one that's living in a colder climate, it's going to be quite a bit larger. A smaller animal still in a warm climate is going to be smaller than both of those. So small animals versus large animals, there's a little bit of difference in activity cost, number one, but it also, you can see, refers to climate. So climate has a big effect. The growth rate of different things, the growth rate is this one. Notice that the growth rate, there's a lot of energy going into growing for a mouse. That's mainly because they don't live all that long, and a lot of their life cycle is spent on growing and then producing offspring. You can see also this is reproductive effort for those guys, all right? So very large reproductive effort. Look at the ectotherm. The ectotherm, not a lot of energy spent on growth. There is a fair amount of energy spent on reproduction. All right, so these ectotherms vary quite a bit, but the basal metabolic rate and the activity are the largest things there. All right, so anyway, that's a comparison of energy budgets. Okay, the next subject is homeostasis. Homeostasis just means keeping things, or keeping the body in a constant state, both in terms of it's the internal environment, really. So it can be in terms of temperature, in terms of energy needs, in terms of materials that it's obtaining or having, or metabolic rates, all right? And a lot of that has to do with what they call the interstitial fluid. So this is the fluid that you find between cells. Remember that most things that we talked about in terms of passing materials in and out of cells had to go through water, really. And that's probably because the organism started off in water, even as a single-celled organism. But as they became multicellular, this water-ish kind of stuff, which is the extracellular matrix, that is the aqueous solution through which things can pass in and out of cells to the next neighboring cell. If it was going to have to change states of matter, for example, to become a gas to do that, and or have to change from the medium that it was traveling through, there would be some other problems, or it just wouldn't be as fast and it wouldn't be as efficient. So the most efficient way is water to water to water, all right? Cell water, interstitial fluid to cell water, that kind of thing. Okay, so this interstitial fluid and maintaining the interstitial fluid is really important. You might have heard things like stay hydrated, right? And that has to do with making sure that you have plenty of fluid between your cells so that there can be good exchange. So the endotherms maintain the interstitial fluid temperature at a super narrow range. The ectotherms, of course, a little less narrow. There's also a pH range. In other words, humans' blood pH, or pH, is roughly around 7 and 7.4, up a little, down a little, or whatever, but it should stay around that. So again, an endotherm, very narrow. Some other organisms may be a little bit broader. Blood sugar range, also usually around 90 to 100 milligrams per 100 mils of water. 100 mils of blood. Going way up or way down is not good for your blood sugar. So these kinds of organisms are very narrow, so that's endotherms. They are also given another name in regards to homeostasis. So it's kind of a similar sort of naming, but it's different. One is called a regulator. And one is called a conformer. Okay, so as you might imagine, a regulator is what we were just talking about, like an endotherm, very, very narrow range, etc. And a conformer has it basically has the environment is sort of dictating or allowing the internal conditions to vary somewhat with the environmental change. That doesn't mean they don't do things to try to, make it less broad, but they still may have a broader range. Okay, so there's different mechanisms for that internal control. So we're going to talk about what some of these different things are. One thing is you can have some kind of regulation. Okay, so if you have regulation at all, you're going to have three components to that regulation. The components are a receptor, a control center, and an effector. So I'm going to write that on the board, and then I'm going to put an overhead up. All right. So if you're a regulator and you're going to regulate, then you're going to have a receptor. Okay. A control center. And an effector. So 1, 2, 3. Right? So now we're going to go on to an overhead. These are similar to the negative feedbacks that we had for metabolic control, but these are more in regards to homeostasis, or temperature in this case. All right, let me just erase this. Okay, so looking at this, hopefully this is focusing here. Hopefully that's a little bit better for you guys. So looking at this is talking about, let's say for example, I have the room temperature decreases. Then I'm going to have, so this is my receptor, or the receptor is like setting a reception of that room temperature going down. I have a control center that is then going to start generating some heat, and that heat will get produced until it's too hot, and then it'll turn off until the room temperature decreases and going this way. So actually I probably should have started on this side. This side, that is, the room temperature is too hot, the heater gets turned off, and then there's nothing happening, so the room temperature decreases and you go this direction. You can also do it the other way. In other words, this side, it gets too cold. It gets too cold, you turn the heat on, heat is produced, room temperature increases. But all of these are called the negative feedbacks. In other words, if I have something happening and then the response is it slows down, then that's going to turn on the thing that makes that something happening. So this is called a negative feedback loop. So anyway, so that's how you might do some thermoregulation, or I'm sorry, homeostasis regulation. Now this one was in regards to temperature. You don't always do it in regards to temperature. So we'll talk more about different things.